Good afternoon. My name is Heather Wilson. I'm Deputy Director here at Cameron Art Museum. And today it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce a man that needs no introduction. I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Fonvielle for what he is saying is going to be his last lecture on the Battle of Forks Road. Dr. Fonvielle is a brilliant historian, educator, and storyteller, and author. And he is a professor emeritus from the Department of History at UNCW. Chris is the historian of the Battle of Forks Road and the reason that Stephen Hay's sculpture Boundless is now here at CAM. Without Chris and his curiosity about the site, the earthworks at Forks Road would likely be gone, and with them the last living vestige of Federal Point Road and the stories of over 1,800 USCT who fought here where the museum now stands. Chris, we at Cameron Art Museum are so grateful to you for your service and for your commitment to the history of the Lower Cape Fear. Thank you for your efforts to preserve and interpret the story of the Battle of Forks Road. Thank you for your leadership, your vision, and your friendship. And I will also say that Chris has been editing grants that I've written for this project since the beginning, and man, he's a great teacher and a great editor. So Chris, I have a couple things that I'd like to tell you today. We have a wonderful anonymous donor that has made a gift to Cameron Art Museum and to the USCT Park to place one of the chairs at the park. Will be named in your honor to permanently recognize your contribution as the historian of the Battle of Forks Road. We are so grateful, Chris. And we know that your impact on the museum and on the history of the Lower Cape Fear will be felt for years and years to come. Thank you so much. I've got a little gift bag for you from the museum. We thought you might like a bottle of champagne. I thought you and Nancy, you can, I can get you a glass. I thought you and Nancy might appreciate that. And you've also got a lifetime membership to Cameron Art Museum. You're always welcome here. So thank you everyone and enjoy.
I was the anonymous donor. I sound so much better on paper than I am in real life. Just ask my wife Nancy, who's in the crowd. Thank y'all very much for coming to what will be my swan song. This will be my last public presentation of Battle of Forks Road at the Cameron Art Museum. And Heather, and Nan, I don't remember how many times I've given this talk. I'm starting to feel like the guy who came out of the store in the shopping center and he couldn't find his keys in his pockets. He's fumbling around and he realizes that he must have left them in the car. So he goes out to the parking lot, he can't find the car, so he thinks that he's left the car keys in the ignition and someone had stolen the car. So he calls the police to report a stolen car. Then he figures, well, I've got to call my wife. She's got to come pick me up, and she's going to be all over me about leaving my keys in the car, and the car's been stolen. It's always complaining about me losing them. So he finally gets the courage, he calls his wife, and he says, honey, I've left my car keys in the car's been stolen, come pick me up. He said, you're kidding. I dropped you off at shopping center. Well, then will you come pick me up? I will if you tell this policeman that I did not steal your car. It has been a wonderful journey. From the very beginning, I don't know how to describe the process. Well, I'll come back to all this. I feel kind of like Adam in the book of Genesis in a way with this story. And there's been a lot of begetting in the last 43 years, but we'll come back to that. But let's talk a little bit about the history of the battle and the significance. I call it Glory at Wilmington, and I unabashedly stole that title from the movie Glory about the 54th Massachusetts, and so far no one has gotten on me about copyright. Can we dim the light, man? Okay, thank you.
Chris, can you turn the volume up?
How's that? Is that better? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. We've just reprinted about 500 copies of Glory at Wilmington, which will probably be the last printing of that, and they're available in the gift shop. And I dedicated to Fred Sweetcorn Johnson, who was a Korean War veteran, U.S. colored troops reenactor, and a big supporter of this site, who passed away in 2016. He used to tell me that his wife hated that nickname because it was given to him by one of his girlfriends before he got married. Now, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest seaport, its most populated city. It would become increasingly important during the Civil War as the Confederacy's main seaport, and I argue that it was the most important city by 1864. Wilmington was, like all southern seaports, under naval blockade since the beginning of the war. U.S. warships were deployed off the Cape Fear coast to try and prevent Confederate commerce vessels from smuggling supplies from overseas. Great Britain was the Confederacy's main trading partner, and the Confederacy fought as long as it did because it was able to receive, in effect, guns for cotton. The South traded its greatest commodity, cotton, for military supplies as well as civilian goods to help sustain its war effort. And Wilmington increasingly became very important as a seaport to receive these supplies, particularly after the capture of New Orleans in the Gulf, and Charleston was put under siege in 1863. And Wilmington had railroads that were able to, the lines along which these supplies were sent to the soldiers on the battlefront and civilians on the home front. The most important of Wilmington's three railroads was the Wilmington and Weldon, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, where it connected to the Petersburg and Weldon, and that became General Robert E. Lee's main artery of supplies by 1863. And by 1864, he said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So Wilmington became heavily defended. Other than Charleston, it was the most heavily defended southern seaport, with most of the forts at the mouth of the river, at Old Inlet and at New Inlet. It was guarded by Fort Fisher to provide covering fire for these blockade running vessels as they came and went with their vital cargoes. The Union would not go after Wilmington until 1864, and that's a conversation that we could have on another day. Why did it take them so long? If Wilmington was so important, why did it take so long for them to attack the defenses guarding the city? They did not until Christmas of 1864, attacking Fort Fisher at New Inlet, which was the most popular entryway for these blockade-running vessels. It turned out to be the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War, but the Confederate defenses and defenders won the day, and the Federals withdrew. The commander of U.S. Army Forces, U.S. Grant, had been largely indifferent to the attack on Wilmington at Christmas '64 because he had, since the summer of '64, been battling against Robert E. Lee's strongly entrenched Army of Northern Virginia around Petersburg. Grant was trying desperately to capture Petersburg and then move on to Richmond to try and bring this 4 years long bloody war to an end. It was a war of stalemate and attrition, with Lee's army being kept alive by the lifeline of the Confederacy through Wilmington. So the Federals were not victorious in their first attack on Fort Fisher, but then Grant took a heightened interest in capturing not just Fort Fisher, but in capturing Wilmington because of William T. Sherman's capture of Savannah, 300 miles south of Wilmington. at Christmas 1864. He presented the city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Tell them I'll take a double large pizza with extra pepperoni. Okay, Ken? And Grant, for his part, was determined to transfer Sherman's 60,000-man army from Savannah up the coast to Petersburg for one final push against Lee's strongly entrenched army. But Sherman, having successfully marched from Atlanta, which he captured in early September of 64, across the breadth of the state of Georgia, now he'd captured Savannah in his famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, march to the sea. Now he proposes to Grant to do the same thing in the Carolinas, to destroy everything in South Carolina, where the war had started, enter North Carolina, capture Goldsboro on the Wilmington Railroad. From there, he could go west to Raleigh, south to Wilmington, if need be, or preferably right up the Wilmington Railroad to strike the underbelly of Lee's army at Petersburg. So Grant would push him from the east, Sherman would attack from the south, they would drive him into open ground, and then attack him in a pincer move and destroy the army. And Grant later said, I would have trusted this movement to no other general officer but William T. Sherman, and he authorized the northern expedition, or what historians call the Carolinas Campaign. But to assure its success, Grant wanted to provide a haven on the seacoast, roughly halfway between Savannah and Petersburg, where Sherman could retreat if he got into trouble, because no one knew what kind of opposition he would face in the Carolinas, or from where reinforcements and supplies could be sent to Sherman if he could make it to Fayetteville, North Carolina, on the Cape Fear River. So, disinterested in that first attack on Fort Fisher, now Grant is determined to capture Wilmington for the railroads and the river in support of Sherman's Carolinas campaign. So 2.5 weeks after they had failed to capture Fort Fisher at Christmas of '64, they're back in mid-January in what became the largest amphibious operation in American military history until D-Day World War II. Second largest naval bombardment, expeditionary forces go ashore, they attack the fort, and after 2.5 days of bombardment, Union forces successful in capturing the fort in support of Sherman's Carolinas campaign. Well, they now established a foothold south of Wilmington at Fort Fisher, but Wilmington is the objective, to get the railroads and the river. Grant is now so determined that he personally leaves City Point, his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, travels down the coast to the Cape Fear to hold a war council on the best way to capture Wilmington. It's the only time Grant ever came to the Wilmington area. So he personally authorizes this attack. And on the east side of the Cape Fear River, the forces that had captured Fort Fisher, badly bloodied in their attack, would now move up the east side while reinforcements would arrive to go up the west side. And on the east side of the river to attack Wilmington, it would be U.S. colored troops. And in fact, they defeated Confederate forces at the Battle of Sugarloaf on February the 11th, which was the opening battle of the Wilmington Campaign. I just led the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable on a tour of the Battle of Sugarloaf yesterday. So U.S. colored troops won that battle just 9 days before they would fight this battle. So it's an ongoing story. So Confederate forces now retreat from Sugarloaf and head towards Wilmington. And I love this part of the story. It's not U.S. colored troops, but it's a reflection of how this was a brother against brother war. One of the soldiers in General Hoke's army was Corporal Hosey Lewis Horn, who was a farmer from New Hanover County. And some years ago, I had gone into a florist shop here in Wilmington. You Wilmingtonians will remember Will Reeder's florist on Oleander Drive. and to buy some flowers for a girlfriend. I have to be careful telling the story because the girlfriend was not Nancy. This was pre-Nancy. I was not yet married, so it's pre-Nancy. Got that? And the gentleman who waited on me, Robert Horn, fell into a discussion about local history. I was serving as the last curator of the Blockade Runner Museum at the time. And he said, I've got a story to tell you. My grandfather, this young man, Hosey Lewis Horn, fought against his brother at the Battle of Fort Fisher. And I've got a photograph of my grandfather, and here it is in uniform. Nancy says he looks like Opie Taylor from the Andy Griffith Show. But I only had the story. But when I was working on my master's thesis, and I was working in part on the battle that was fought here, I ran across a February 27th, 1865 newspaper article in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And there's a long report by an embedded reporter about on-field military operations in the Wilmington Campaign. And there was one small paragraph titled "An Incident." And he said, our army got about halfway between Sugarloaf and Wilmington, and we stopped in the road to rest. And a young officer asked permission to step out of line and visit a house by the roadside. When his commanding officer asked what business he had at the house, he said, that is the residence of my boyhood, and it's where my parents live. Soon the boy was clasped in the arms of his overjoyed mother, the reporter wrote. That mother has a son in both armies. And I think it gave a lot of credence to the Horn family tradition of these two young brothers fighting against each other, because the Horn family home was right on the side of the Federal Point Road that both armies marched on as they moved towards Wilmington. And the Confederate brother, of course, would have understandably stopped to say goodbye to his parents as the Confederate Army retreated past the house on February the 19th, and it would made, and here's the Federal Point Road that I photographed in 1980, it would have made perfect sense that the next day the Union brother would have stopped to say hello to his parents who he had not seen in a couple of years after joining the Union Army. And I have asked descendants of both of those young men over the years, how was it that Jacob Horn, who was from New Hanover County, also went and joined the Union Army? And what was their relationship after the war? And depending on who you ask, they either got along great or they never spoke to each other again for the rest of their lives. And I think there's probably somewhere in between that they eventually reconciled, as would the nation. It took some time, passions had to cool, but as the years went by, eventually they reconciled. So there is their mother. I do not have a photograph of Jacob Horn, the Union brother, but Mr. Bruce Cameron, who owned the property where the Cameron Art Museum is built, it's named for his late wife, Louise Wells Cameron. That was his great-great-grandmother. And those two boys were his great-great-uncles. So there was that personal connection between Mr. Bruce, who he did not know about, and the Battle of Forge Road. Well, the Federals would hotly pursue the retreating Confederates with the U.S. colored troops on the skirmish line, led by General Charles J. Payne. The U.S. colored troops officers were generally white. There were some African-American officers, but the higher-ranking field-grade officers were white, and this Bostonian was the leader of the U.S. Colored Troops Brigades, 2 of them, 3,300 of them in the Wilmington Campaign. And at the head of that column was the 5th U.S. Colored Troops seen in this photograph. So they were the skirmishers that were engaged in a running firefight with the Confederate rear guard, protecting the main army as it retreated towards Wilmington. The firing was just kind of off and on. There was no general engagement until the troops reached here after the Battle of Sugarloaf. So by 1865, there were roughly 179,000 young black men who wore blue uniforms, 80% of whom were Southern born, meaning that the vast majority of them were escaped enslaved people. And they joined Union Army units that were officially designated U.S. colored troops. Now, there's some exceptions, like the 54th Massachusetts, that was the first African-American unit raised in the North. The sister unit, the 55th Massachusetts. And of course, the 54th was the subject of the movie Glory. But most of these units were later designated U.S. colored troop units, and they fought in 41 major battles. And more than 400 smaller actions, including the battles of Sugarloaf and Forks Road. So they would play a vital role in Union victory. They were not allowed to join U.S. military forces until 1863, after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation and the establishment of the U.S. Colored Troops Bureau. But then they served in very important roles during the war. And now here they are, a part of the Provisional Corps that has captured Fort Fisher. They have fought at Sugarloaf, and now they're moving on Wilmington in an effort to support Sherman's Carolinas campaign. So here's the situation. After Sugarloaf, they had moved up the east side of the Cape Fear River to about 3 miles south of the city. A flotilla of Union warships are providing covering fire, and then you've got Union troops moving up the west side of the Cape Fear River as well. And General Hope's Confederate Army makes a last stand here at this battlefield. They have dug field works from the Cape Fear River, resting on these batteries out. Let's see if I can get this pointer. From this area all the way out to what is today Longleaf Pine Park. So this was an extensive line of field works and strongly built. This is the way that they looked in 1980 when I first came out here. Far different from their appearance today. But you can see the Federal Point Road cuts right through the middle of the earthworks. I was brought out here by a World War II veteran who had metal detected some dropped and fired bullets, but he didn't know anything about the history of the site. And so I spent the coming years exploring what happened here, who was involved, and why it was important, and interpreting the history. But I took this photograph in 1980. Why is it called the Battle of Forks Road? Well, there's very little written about this battle. It took me years to find virtually anything, looking in newspapers and regimental histories, and this came from the official records of the Union and Confederate armies that were published in the late 19th century. And these two pieces of correspondence are written by General Hope from Forks Road and Crossroads. And I think it was probably named because of that intersection right there. When I first came out here in 1980, it was very remote. The only development was Pine Valley. So it was just an open pine savanna. And here were these earthworks. What did they mean? And then I found this correspondence when I was working on my master's thesis, Forks Road, Crossroads, and I think because there were no discernible landmarks in the area, except for that intersection of the Federal Point Road, which is the Carolina Beach Road of this day. Carolina Beach Road was built in 1929, and it's a mile further to the west. So the Federal Point Road, which Southerners renamed the Confederate Point Road during the war, was the main avenue between Wilmington and the lower reaches of United County. So all traffic going to and from Fort Fisher went through this site. And there is an intersection with this by-road that runs off toward the Cape Fear River. So I think, in referring to this area, It was the crossroads or the intersection or the Forks Road there. And I like Forks Road better than Crossroads. So I called it the Battle of Forks Road. They just have a nicer ring to it now. And it seems to have caught on. I noticed turning in on Museum Drive that there's the Forks at Barclay. So I'm glad it stuck. But it does. It has a nicer ring to it, doesn't it, than Crossroads. Battle of Crossroads? Battle of Forks Road. So that's why I named it the Battle of Forks Road. And the lead units here, John Ames's brigade of U.S. Colored Troops and Elias Wright's brigade, and then it was Elias Wright's brigade, again with the 5th U.S. Colored Troops at the lead that would attack the strongly defended works here with the Wilmington Horse Artillery deployed right there where the road cuts through the earthworks. These young men showed their mettle and their great worth as combatants in charging directly into the Confederate defenses while they're being blasted with canister from those cannons and volleys of rifle musketry. And they got within about 150 yards of the works before it was just too much. You can imagine the great volleys of lead and iron coming after them, and they just ducked their heads and pulled their hats over their eyes and just charged forward. And it took brave men to do that, but they could not overrun the works. Among them would be the 5th, also the first U.S. Colored Troops seen here in 1864. And among them would be 4 future Medal of Honor winners. They had fought bravely at Chaffin's Farm in Virginia in September of 1864, and 4 young men who would be awarded the nation's highest recognition for duty in the military, the Medal of Honor, were here at Forks Road, and among them would be Robert Penn of the 5th U.S. Colored Troops and Powhatan Beatty, also of the 5th U.S. Colored Troops. And they had been enslaved young men who escaped, made their way to Ohio, where they joined the 5th U.S. Colored Troops, and they fought here at the Battle of Forks Road, along with their black brothers. So the U.S. Colored Troops were unable to overrun the Confederate defenses. Then it turned into basically a 34-hour shootout as the U.S. Colored Troops withdrew. They dug their own line of defenses. They sent out skirmishers, and they would just exchange gunfire with the Confederates over about the next day and a half or so. The earthworks that the U.S. Colored Troops built were still here in 1980 on the north end of Halliburton Park, and sadly were destroyed when that area was developed. Sun Valley and George Anderson Drive was pushed through. But they were still here in 1980. It's too bad that they were destroyed, but they dug in about 500 yards south of here. Well, the Confederates eventually abandoned the Forks Road position in the early morning hours of February the 22nd and retreated toward Wilmington and then towards into the interior of North Carolina, where they joined up with other Confederate forces that were being pushed out of South Carolina by General Sherman's rapidly advancing army. And then that was, as one Confederate soldier said about it, the last rays of the departing hope for the Confederacy. Because blockade running was now ended. Union forces moved in on February 22nd to capture the city. There was great fanfare and celebration among African-American residents when U.S. Colored Troops marched into the city with the sun shining off their barrels and their rifle muskets and their bayonets, and they're playing the John Brown song, and they march into the city, and the African-American residents just joyous in their celebration of their liberators. And I ran across one wonderful story in the Christian Recorder, an African-American Philadelphia-based newspaper, about one Wilmington woman who recognized her son in the ranks of those soldiers as they marched into town. He had escaped slavery in Wilmington. He had joined U.S. colored troops. His name is not recorded. But when she saw him in the line, she's on the sidewalk, and here come the U.S. colored troops marching into the city. She ran out into the street and jumped into his arms. He had left an enslaved young man. He returns as a liberated young man and her liberator. And that's why this battle was so important. They have become liberated, and now they are the liberators. So blockade running ended at Wilmington. As Lee had predicted, if Wilmington falls, he could not maintain his army. He tried to escape from Petersburg on April the 2nd and was hotly pursued by General Grant's army, who caught up with Lee at Appomattox Courthouse and forced his surrender on April the 9th, 1865, exactly 46 days after federal forces captured Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, Wilmington now in the hands of their Union captors. Many now freed men would join the United States colored troops and would serve the remainder of the war with those units. And many of them, when the war ended and they mustered out, guess where they made their home? Wilmington, North Carolina, which was considered a mecca of opportunity for African Americans, and would be until 1898. So the seeds of 1898 really were laid in the post-war years, sadly. But African Americans became thriving, successful, valuable members of the Wilmington community for many decades. They did good service as members of the U.S. colored troops. I love this photograph. This is an unidentified image of a soldier in the 5th U.S. colored troop. But he is so proud. You see it in his face. And of course, photographs of hard photographs like this ambrotype are very rare, and particularly of U.S. colored troops, because there were comparatively few of them to the 2 million Union soldiers who fought during the Civil War. So this is the way the earthworks looked when I came here in 1980. I did a lot of exploration on the battlefield, and then in the documents, what few I could find, and slowly was able to piece together what happened here, who was involved, why this was important, and provided my interpretation of what happened. Mr. Bruce, and this is one of my favorite photographs, was largely responsible for the preservation of the battlefield, the earthworks, and when the museum was built, he insisted that the battle be interpreted. And Deborah Velders, who was then the executive director, did a good job of that. Of course, now a new staff led by Ann Brennan and Heather Wilson, and you've got Daniel Jones, and you've got Brandt here, and so many other people on staff have been instrumental in not just interpreting the battle, but commemorating the battle. And one intern who now works for the Cape Fear Museum, one of my former students, she was a glutton for punishment. I think she took me like for 5 classes or something. Devin Kelly, she's here all the way in the back row. She didn't want to sit up here right next to me. She did a lot of great research by going into the U.S. colored troop roles and determining exactly what soldiers were with the 5th U.S. colored troops, the 1st U.S. colored troops that probably fought here at the Battle of Forks Road. And she came up with more than 1,800 names. And that's a very tedious task. So I give her great credit. When I first started working in that battle, You actually had to go to the archives in Washington, D.C. to look at the muster rolls. Now you've got foldfree.com and you can go online. It's an easier process, but still time-consuming and labor-intensive, and I give them a lot of credit for doing that. The Cape Fear Revolutionary, or Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable and other local history groups did some restoration of the earthworks in 2002. The 140th and 2005 was a very big event, but basically, with a couple of exceptions, the pandemic, the Battle Forks Road has been commemorated annually since 2000. Since 2002. And U.S. Colored Troop reenactors come here from all over the country to participate in the commemoration activities. In June 2015, the Wilmington Commission on African American History applied for and got a North Carolina Highway Historical Markers to the Battle of Forks Road, which is installed on 17th Street. Just several hundred yards from where the battle was actually fought. And here's a photograph of the unveiling of that on Juneteenth, 2015. And then, of course, more recently, the wonderful African-American artist Stephen Hayes produced the Boundless sculpture, which is the first figurative sculpture to United States colored troops in North Carolina. And I have to give credit to Heather Wilson, particularly Deputy Director of the museum. She worked so tirelessly in this commemorative effort, getting grants and seeking out donors. And they finally were able to contract with Stephen Hayes, who teaches at Duke University, by the way, to do this sculpture. And it is, of course, a life-size memorial to the U.S. colored troops. And he used descendants of young men who fought here or military veterans to get the faces. And I asked him if I could sort of get in there somehow. He said that ain't quite fit the profile. But it's a wonderful sculpture. And they are marching toward freedom forever. Forever marching toward liberty and freedom. And it is such a wonderful memorial, and it's now a part, of course, of the U.S. Colored Troops Park. So that my effort initially was one of discovery, and then of interpretation. And now the effort is directed toward commemoration, which is so important. And this is the first U.S. Colored Troops Park in the nation, thanks to Heather Wilson, the Cameron Art Museum, and its staff. And I think they deserve all the credit in the world for this wonderful, wonderful park. So my part of the story, which began 43 years ago, is included in this limited revised edition of Glory at Wilmington, the Battle of Forks Road, and ends with the commemoration efforts in the last few years. It's been a wonderful journey. I can't tell you, I thought long and hard about this. I don't know why God or the fates or the spirits of those African-American soldiers chose me to sort of jumpstart this whole process. I've enjoyed the journey. My part now comes to an end. I've done what I can do. I'm going to concentrate on other projects. It's been a wonderful experience. I've met some wonderful people along the way. I've made some good friends. It's been fantastic working with the staff of the Cameron Art Museum and meeting wonderful people like you and being able to share at least my portion of the story with y'all. And I really appreciate y'all coming today. Nancy said, one day, when all is said and done, and you get to wherever you're going, you just may be met by those veterans of U.S. colored troops. And they're going to say thank you. And I'm going to say, no, thank you. This has been a wonderful journey. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful journey. Thank you all very much. Oh, sit down. I don't need a standing ovation. I would deserve a standing. I want those U.S. colored troops to give me a standing ovation when I get there. No, I'll be glad to take any questions. How long did that take? How much time did that take? Am I good? Are we good? Any questions?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Okay, the victory celebration parade, soon it was Touch Street.
Mhm.
Do you know if the colored troops were put at the back as kind of a nudge against them, or why weren't they leading the parade? Do you know anything about that?
It's great. Did y'all hear that? What position in the line were the United States colored troops when the Union Army entered Wilmington? And it's the sad part of the story. They had led the attack on Wilmington on the east side of the Cape Fear River. They suffered more than 50% of all casualties, that's killed and wounded, in the Wilmington Campaign. Mostly at the Battle of Sugarloaf and the Battle of Forks Road. Records are incomplete. We believe that there were probably 50 to 60 casualties here. But when Wilmington had been evacuated by the Confederate Army, and General Terry's corps on this side, which included the 2 brigades of U.S. colored troops, picked up their march toward Wilmington, 3 miles. White troops were set to the front. They had been held in reserve at the Battle of Forks Road. Now, they did some fighting further to the west, between here and the Cape Fear River. They were probing the weak points along the Confederate line. Remember, the line ran all the way to the Cape Fear River. So the white troops were probing to the west, searching for a weak point in the line they could exploit, without success. So the fighting in Forks Road was done by the U.S. colored troops. But then when they picked up a march into Wilmington, the white troops, then Pine Valley School, basically, were allowed to march into Wilmington first, and the African Americans were sent to the back of the bus. So that's a sad part of the story. But that said, you know, the African American residents of Wilmington were very excited about their appearance.
I guess you could say maybe they saved the best for last. Then.
Oh, I like that. We should have consulted. I would have put that in there. That's why I love doing this.
There are a lot of USCK troops, and are they mostly buried at the National Cemetery, or where are they buried?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Did y'all hear that? Where are the U.S. colored troops who fought here and then became residents of Wilmington? Where are they buried? The vast majority are buried in our National Cemetery. And you have to be a U.S. military personnel or a spouse to be buried in a national cemetery. There are 5 national cemeteries in North Carolina, 1 in Wilmington at 20th and Market Streets. And there are more than 500 former U.S. colored troops buried in our national cemetery. I also believe, however, there are all U.S. colored troops buried on this battlefield. Because generally speaking, soldiers who were killed in battle were buried on hallowed ground. Only since the Vietnam War are all American military personnel brought home. But at that time, you buried them on the battlefield. And now, after the war, the federal government and then southern state governments did sweep through forts and posts and battlefields and exhume the remains of as many of their military personnel as possible to be buried, say, in the National Cemetery or in Oakdale Cemetery. But I absolutely am convinced that some of those U.S. colored troops are buried, while not on the Cameron Art Museum grounds, probably in Howard Barton Park. And you know what? Ground penetrating radar, I couldn't think of the word. I think that we may discover some of those burial sites in Fiji. I think it deserves to be done. So that might be another effort in the commemorative activity. Yes, sir.
Do we know where Sugarloaf was or is? About how far down Carolina?
Oh, yeah, I led a tour of the Sugarloaf battlefield yesterday.
Oh.
And the Confederate lines ran from what is today Carolina Beach Canal all the way to the Cape Fear River. And until the 1980s, the U.S. colored troops line was still there. And there's still a small segment of it, probably the width of this room, on U.S. federal property that is off limits to the public. If you drive down the Dow Road, Carolina Beach, you see that big sign that says you are now entering U.S. federal property. Do not exit your vehicle. I always exit my vehicle. Look, it's not a crime unless you get caught. So I haven't gotten caught yet. If I did, I'd just ask for forgiveness. But I always visit those U.S. colored troop lines. Now, we didn't do that yesterday because we had 25 people on the tour, and I didn't want to be responsible for the arrest of 25 security forces from Sunny Point. But Sugarloaf is actually a natural sand dune right on the banks of the Cape Fear River, and it's 50 feet high. And that was the eastern, western terminus of Confederate lines.
So it was past Snow's Cut.
It's just south of Snow's Cut, about a mile and a half south of Snow's Cut. And there's a walking trail down the river that you can actually take, but by doing that, you do not see the Confederate earthworks. And you certainly don't see the U.S. colored troop line, which, when I was at the Blockade Runner Museum, was all still there. It ran all the way to the Cape Fear River, hundreds of yards in length. And guess who destroyed it? The federal government. For a beach renourishment project. They didn't know what they were. And I tried to tell them, they wouldn't listen to me. Yes, ma'am.
My great-grandfather, McIntyre fought with 37 Company G, U.S. Country. He was from Pender County, and I visited his older in Washington, D.C. And he shared a lot of what that I did not know about him. His son went to Rocky Mountain with Alex, so I didn't know much about his father, Peter McIntyre. But I've been looking for some kind of record about where he was buried, and I haven't been able to find it. But when in the final records that I found, his other son, tried to get the federal government to help with his burial, and they denied it because he had property here in North Carolina at the time. He had funds within the room. But I still like to know where he was buried, and to find out.
The 37th U.S. colored troops were very active in recruiting African-American residents of the lower Cape Fear into their ranks. Was he from Brunswick County? Do you know?
Pender County.
Okay, Pender County at that time would have been part of New Hanover County. Pender County became Pender County in 1875. So he was from New Hanover County?
Yes.
Well, very active in recruiting local black residents to fill the ranks of the U.S. colored troops, which had been depleted in part by the Wilmington Campaign. How did he end up in Rocky Mountain?
No, his son ended up in Rocky.
Oh, I got you.
When he got sick, he was in Pender County. When he got sick, his youngest son took him to Richmond to care for him in his time of illness.
So he's not buried in our national cemetery?
I don't think so. I don't, I haven't been able to determine where his buried is.
Okay, I would check first with the National Cemetery. We'll talk after the talk,
Okay.
and I'll do what I can to help you out. Sadly, a lot of graves have been lost over the years. A lot of cemeteries have been destroyed. I mean, we've seen that up in Pender County for the last 6 months. The African-American cemetery that were destroyed until local residents stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute. There's an African-American cemetery there, and you're just destroying it. But for a lot of developers, I'm not coming down on developers, but, cemeteries, burial sites, even trees are seen as obstacles to house sites, and thus lack of profits or profits. We know all how this works, power and money, and they're not going to let anything get in the way. So that can be a real problem.
Speaking of developers, how is it that the new homes are really nice homes over here? How are they able to move in on top of this specific ground?
That's, Joe, hear that question? How was it that developers were able to build on top of the Fort Worth battlefield? I fought the second battle for Fort Road in the early 1980s to preserve this battlefield. I knew that this was not only an important Civil War site, but it was an important African-American site. This is the early 1980s. And Harrison and Suggs proposed, were trying to get permission from the county commissioners at that time to build Sun Valley on the west end of Pine Valley. And so I went before county commissioners and I argued the case for the preservation of this battlefield. This was a very important site for several reasons. And while interested in what I had discovered about the importance of the battle, they were unwilling to deny the developers construction of those homes because it would have increased the tax revenues. And so that's what happened. I did get some concessions from the developers. They had to name the streets for the two commanders of the armies here. So the only road in Pine Valley, Sun Valley, that is named for a Union officer is Charles Payne Drive.
Yep.
All the others are named for Confederate officers. And the developer was also supposed to put up a historical marker recognizing the role that the U.S. colored troops played here. Never lived up to that promise. I couldn't continue the battle because I went off to work on my PhD, and I did not return to Wilmington until 1995. And so then I got more involved again in this effort after that time. But that's what happened. It's unfortunate. Yes, sir.
After the troops marched into town and some of the free slaves joined them, did they pretty much hang around the Wilmington area or did those troops march off? And I guess what I'm wondering is if they marched off, what's the situation with the families if they stayed behind? Because did they go back to the people that owned them before, or what happened to them? Did they go back to troops?
U.S. colored troops became part of the occupation force here in Wilmington. And they would be here until 1866. And that was great if you were African American. It was not so great if you were white. And so there were issues, there were racial confrontations, and even smaller riots in the 1860s, 1870s. But no, they were part of the occupation force. And again, when the war ended or they were mustered out in 1866 or 1867, many of them remained in Wilmington or came back to Wilmington and became very valuable members of the community. We had a thriving African-American middle class. They could now become professionals, doctors and lawyers, which they did. And Wilmington was a black majority. It was a black majority city. Now I think we're only about 17% But of course, all of that would change in 1898. Yes, sir.
This history about the Civil War, is this history under the umbrella of critical race theory that so many pioneers did not be taught in public school?
Wow, this is a political minefield. I was a Civil War historian in the Department of History at UNC Wilmington for almost a quarter of a century. And I taught the Civil War as often as possible. And I always talked about the role that African Americans, both military and civilians, played in the war. And I thought that story of the race was very critical. So is that critical race theory? And I guess in a way, but I thought it was important. But it's a very controversial issue. And I'm a historian. I get a little bit off in my mind right here, and I'm probably on the wrong side of most of academia on this. But as a historian, I believe that it is my job to preserve the past, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that all of the statutes are teaching tools. We can learn from them. I think we should have provided, and still can in some cases, historical context in the form of markers and plaques. When were these statues put up? Who erected them? Was there a racial message intended with the erection of these statues and memorials to the Confederacy? I don't think you don't change history, you don't change the past by removing them. And I was all in favor of the kind of effort that the Cameron Art Museum is doing. Expand to this vast array of statues to Confederate leaders by erecting statues to African Americans and Native Americans and Unionists, so that we can keep this very important dialogue of race relations in the South and in our country going. I think it's an important part of the nation's discourse. So anyway, that's my side. Most of my colleagues were take them all down, blow them up, we don't care. But I sort of approach it from a different perspective. And I was on the North Carolina Historical Commission with Governor Cooper petitioned us to give him the authority to remove the Confederate statues on the grounds of the old state capitol in Raleigh. And we studied the issue for a year. We sought legal advice, the advice of historians. We held public forums. We opened up a public portal on the website of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And in the end, 82% of those who responded were in favor of keeping up the statues because they were a part of our history. The statues do not represent who we are, but they did represent who we were. And we can learn much from that. But the governor ended up getting his way anyway, and those memorials came down. So it just thrills me to see the effort that the Cameron Art Museum has made to commemorate this battle, but to commemorate U.S. colored troops, and establishing the first U.S. colored troops park in the United States of America. So how about a round of applause for everyone?
Some descendants of the USCT in the audience, Beverly, of course, as she said, is a descendant of the audience, any other descendants in the audience, we will be celebrating a Descendants Day on November 11th. We are issuing a call for descendants, and Daniel Jones, our cultural curator, is connecting with descendants across the East Coast to bring folks home to Cameron Art Museum to learn about the place where their ancestors are. I did want to let everyone know, based on Mr. Richardson's great question about history, we believe that this is all of our history, right? This is an important story to tell. And towards that effort, we have invited all 8th graders in New Hampshire County. I got a grant to bring all 8th graders from New Hampshire County to Cameron Art Museum to experience the sculpture and to experience that story. They get to watch a short documentary. They get to go to the sculpture and have a tour with Daniel or one of our tour guides. And then they also get to do writing exercises that connect with the core curriculum. We have developed lesson plans that connect deeply with this story that can be used K through 12 and are being distributed across the state. We also hold pre-professional development for teachers so that teachers can learn more about the story. We know that this is empowering, that this is important history, and it's a story that needs to be told. I will tell you that yesterday there were 45 people on Daniel Jones' tour at Boundless, and when he asked them, did anybody know about the story of Battle Fork Road before they found out about the sculpture, only about 5 people raised their hands. We are helping to tell a story that needs to be told, not just for the Cape Fear region, but for our country. If you're interested in helping us to continue to tell this story, please let me know, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. Chris's books are for sale in the gift shop, and he'll be signing books afterwards. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Let me just say just one last thing. Did I mention you, Daniel, in my? I think I did. Daniel Jones in the back is the new cultural curator of the Cameron Art Museum. And I passed the torch to him. He's a wonderful historian. He's going to do a great job with this. I think the story, and this is why I'm stepping away in part. No, number one, I'm old. I'm going to be 70 in May. I'm an old white guy. And I'm now 1/4 the age of Wilmington. That sounds old, doesn't it? But look, the story, I was a part of the discovery and the interpretation of this battle. But Daniel now is a part of the commemoration effort, but also he's going to be the new historian of the Battle of Forks Road. Because you know what? This story needs new storytellers. It needs fresh insights. It needs a different perspective that I can't give it. He can. So I am figuratively and now literally passing the torch to Daniel Jones, and he'll do a great job. So next year. So thank you all very much for being a part of my swan song. Enjoy being with you all.
Thank you, Dr.